Ask anyone under 40 about M*A*S*H, and they'll probably tell you it's the show their parents or grandparents loved, a goofy army comedy set in a Korean War hospital tent. That description isn't wrong. It's just incomplete. Behind the laugh lines and the martinis in the swamp was one of the most contentious, most creatively stubborn productions in the history of American television, a show that nearly got cancelled in its first year, that went to war with its own network over a laugh track, and that turned a real wildfire into one of the most watched pieces of television ever broadcast. Alan Alda, who played Captain Benjamin Franklin Hawkeye Pierce for all 11 seasons, turned 90 in January of 2026. He's now one of only 4 surviving members of the original principal cast, alongside Mike Farrell, Jamie Farr, and Gary Burghoff, according to Wikipedia's ongoing record of the cast. And in interviews over the past year, Alda has kept doing what he's done for decades, reflecting, with remarkable candor, on what that show actually cost the people who made it, and what it gave back to the people who watched it. This is that story. Before M*A*S*H was a television phenomenon, it was a book written by a man who had actually lived it. Richard Hornberger served as a surgeon with the 8055th Mobile Army Surgical Hospital during the Korean War, and years later he turned his memories into a novel, publishing it under the pen name Richard Hooker with the help of writer W.C. Hines. The book blended gallows humor with the blunt, unglamorous reality of a field hospital a few miles from the front, because that combination was, in Hornberger's experience, simply what surviving that job required. Director Robert Altman adapted the novel into a film in 1970, and it became a genuine cultural moment, a box office hit, a Palme d'Or winner at Cannes, and an Academy Award nominee for Best Picture. Crucially, it didn't play like a conventional war movie. It was irreverent, morally messy, and unmistakably shaped by the Vietnam War raging in the background of American life at the time. CBS saw the commercial potential and commissioned a television adaptation, a genuinely risky bet. TV spin-offs of hit films rarely worked. War was an unusually delicate subject for network television in 1972, and there was no guarantee that a smaller-budget weekly series could capture what had made the film distinctive. Producer Gene Reynolds and writer Larry Gelbart were brought in to build the show, and they made an early decision that would define everything that followed. They weren't going to remake the movie. They wanted characters who felt like exhausted, flawed human beings rather than wisecracking archetypes, and they wanted the show to sit in the uncomfortable space between comedy and tragedy rather than picking one side. The pilot aired on September 17, 1972, with Alda in the lead role. Critics were largely positive. Audiences were not, at least not right away. Here's the detail that surprises most people. M*A*S*H was nearly a footnote in television history. Its first season ratings were poor enough, reportedly languishing around 56th place in the national rankings, that cancellation was a live possibility inside CBS. For a series adapted from an award-winning film, those numbers were an embarrassment to network executives who had expected an easy hit. Part of the friction was philosophical. CBS wanted a conventional sitcom. Gelbart and Reynolds were determined to let real consequences exist inside the jokes. That tension crystallized in the first season episode, Sometimes You Hear the Bullet, in which a childhood friend of Hawkeye's dies on the operating table, the first on-screen death of a patient in the series, and Hawkeye breaks down in tears, still in his scrubs. Network executives worried it was too bleak for a comedy slot. It aired anyway, and Alda himself has spoken in interviews with the Television Academy about how deliberately the show pursued that emotional register, and about revisiting and critiquing his own performance in that very scene years later. What actually saved the show wasn't a single triumphant episode, it was a scheduling accident. CBS burned off reruns through the summer of 1973, and with limited competition on a slow viewing night, audiences who'd missed the show the first time discovered it. Then CBS moved M*A*S*H to Saturday nights, directly behind the enormously popular All in the Family. Viewers who were already parked on the couch simply stayed there, and the ratings climbed into the top 10 almost overnight. A show that had nearly been cancelled became one of CBS's signature properties within about a year, and that success only intensified the next fight. Success didn't calm the relationship between the creators and the network. If anything, it escalated it, because now there was more at stake on both sides. CBS's censors treated the show's medical content as a persistent problem, reportedly pushing to minimize visible blood in surgery scenes out of concern for dinner hour audiences, and restricting language the network considered inappropriate for prime time. But the most famous standoff was over the laugh track. In the early 1970s, canned audience laughter was standard practice on virtually every American sitcom, cueing viewers exactly when a joke had landed. Gelbart and Reynolds argued that piping in fake laughter over scenes of doctors trying to save dying soldiers in an operating room was tonally indefensible. CBS wouldn't eliminate the laugh track from the show entirely, but the creators won a meaningful concession. No laugh track would run during operating room scenes. It's a small technical detail, but it mattered enormously to the show's identity. It's part of why the surgical scenes still land with a starkness that comedies of that era simply didn't attempt. Some scripts were rejected outright by the network for being too dark for the time slot, but the creative team kept pushing, episode after episode, for the show to be allowed to take war seriously even while it made people laugh. Just as the show hit its commercial stride, it started losing key members of its ensemble, and the way the writers handled those exits became some of the most talked about television of the decade. McLean Stevenson, who played the amiable commanding officer Lieutenant Colonel Henry Blake, wanted out after 3 seasons. He was eager to headline his own series rather than remain part of an ensemble. Instead of giving Henry a quiet, happy send-off, the writers chose something far riskier. In the season 3 finale, Abyssinia, Henry, Blake is discharged and boards a transport plane home, only for Radar to walk into the operating room moments later and read a telegram reporting that the plane was shot down over the Sea of Japan, with no survivors. The production reportedly withheld the twist from much of the cast until shortly before filming, so that their shocked reactions on camera would be genuine. The response from viewers was immediate and furious. CBS was flooded with complaints from audiences who felt blindsided by a death with no warning. Not long after, Wayne Rogers, who played Hawkeye's close friend and fellow surgeon-trapper John McIntyre, left the show as well, reportedly over dissatisfaction with how his character was being used relative to Alda's. Because Rogers had never signed a formal contract for the role, he was able to depart before season 4, and the writers addressed his absence with little more than a passing line of dialogue. These consecutive high-profile exits fed years of tabloid speculation about tension on set and about Alda's growing creative influence over the show, speculation that's difficult to verify but that has followed the production's reputation ever since. To rebuild the ensemble, the show brought in Mike Farrell as B.J. Honeycutt and Harry Morgan as Colonel Sherman Potter, both of whom became long-term fixtures and, in Farrell's case, one of the 4 surviving original cast members alive today. What separated M*A*S*H from other sitcoms of its era wasn't just its willingness to be sad. It was the amount of effort the creative team put into getting the details right, particularly after losing major cast members and needing the show's foundation to feel unshakable. Members of the production reportedly traveled to speak with real doctors and nurses who had served in Korean warfield hospitals, gathering first-hand accounts of what those hospitals and that gallows humor actually felt like, and folding those details back into scripts. The show's exterior, Korea, was actually Malibu Creek State Park in the Santa Monica Mountains, on land that was then part of a 20th-century Fox movie ranch. Its rolling, dry hills stood in for the Korean countryside for over a decade of filming, according to the park's own historical materials. It was not a comfortable location to work. Cast and crew spent long days there in heavy period uniforms under the Southern California sun. Then, in October of 1982, while the production was in the process of shooting its series finale, a real wildfire tore through Malibu Creek State Park and destroyed much of the standing outdoor set. According to production records held by the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History, filming of the finale had run from late September into early October, and the fire hit on October 9th, while the episode was still being shot. Rather than rebuild the set and quietly move on, the writers made an unusual choice. They wrote the fire directly into the finale's story, adding scenes in which North Korean incendiary devices are said to spark a blaze that forces the 4077th to evacuate. Actors Harry Morgan and Kelly Nakahara returned to the site on October 15th to film new material built around the real damage, and editors reused evacuation footage from an earlier Season 5 episode, Bug Out, to help tell the story. What audiences eventually watched? the smoke, the scramble, the abandoned camp, was, in significant part, real wreckage from a real disaster that happened mid-production. By its final seasons, M*A*S*H was a consistent ratings powerhouse, and CBS reportedly wanted the show to continue indefinitely. Alda and the rest of the creative team felt differently. Having watched other long-running series decline in quality once they overstayed their welcome, they preferred to end the show while it was still, by most measures, at its peak, a decision that let them close out the story on their own terms rather than let a network drag it out for diminishing returns. CBS agreed to a feature-length finale. Goodbye, Farewell and Amen was scripted between April and September of 1982, ran roughly 2.5 hours, several times the length of a normal episode, and aired on February 28, 1983, with Alda directing. According to figures widely reported at the time and preserved in retrospectives like the Smithsonian's, the broadcast drew an estimated 105.9 million viewers, a share so dominant that a large majority of televisions in use across the country that night were tuned to the same program. It remains, to this day, the most watched scripted television episode in American history, a record no single episode of any modern scripted series, broadcast or streaming, has come close to matching, largely because television audiences are now spread across far more channels and platforms than existed in 1983. The end of production didn't end the show's cultural or financial life. M*A*S*H became a syndication mainstay through the 1980s and 90s, generating substantial ongoing revenue for its studio, and it has continued to circulate through cable reruns and, more recently, streaming platforms that carry all 251 episodes. Its bigger legacy is structural. Before M*A*S*H, American network television largely treated comedy and drama as separate lanes. A sitcom told jokes, a drama told serious stories, and a single half-hour rarely tried to do both. M*A*S*H helped establish what's now generally called the dramedy, a format willing to move from a punchline to genuine grief inside the same episode. Later medical and workplace dramas that blend humor with real emotional stakes, shows frequently cited in television criticism as descendants of this approach, including ER and Scrubs, owe a structural debt to the template M*A*S*H helped establish decades earlier. The show also lost one of its own in recent years. In May of 2025, Loretta Swit, who played Major Margaret "Hot Lips" Houlihan across the show's entire run, one of the few actors present in both the pilot and the finale, passed away, an event widely reported at the time and one that left only 4 surviving members of the original principal cast. Which brings the story back to Alda himself. He turned 90 on January 28, 2026, and by his own account, celebrated quietly with family, a low-key evening, dinner out, and rum cake at home, according to photos and a note shared publicly by his grandson at the time. Alda has lived with Parkinson's disease since being diagnosed in 2015. He disclosed the diagnosis publicly in 2018 and has continued working and speaking since. In conversations over the past year, including a widely covered appearance at the 92nd Street Y in New York with Joy Behar and Roger Rosenblatt, Alda has spoken with characteristic humor about aging with the condition, describing the day-to-day management of Parkinson's as something that has grown from a part-time job to almost a full-time job. While insisting the process of solving each new small problem still leaves him feeling, in his words, like he'd accomplished something. He's continued to note that keeping a sense of humor about it is less a coping mechanism than a survival strategy, a philosophy that, notably, sounds a great deal like the one M*A*S*H itself was built on. But when interviewers ask him to reflect on the show's legacy, Alda tends to steer away from ratings records and syndication money. What he comes back to, repeatedly, are the strangers who approach him decades later to say that watching Hawkeye Pierce grind through exhaustion to save lives in that operating room was part of what pushed them toward medicine as a career. For Alda, that's the measure that actually matters, evidence that a character built to entertain people on a Monday night in the 1970s ended up quietly shaping real decisions in the real world. More than 40 years after Goodbye, Farewell and Amen aired, the story of the fictional 4077th Mobile Army Surgical Hospital hasn't faded the way most 1970s television has. It endures because the people who made it refused to pick a single lane, refused to be only funny or only serious. and because, at 90, its last surviving lead is still willing to talk honestly about what that fight actually cost and what it was worth. What's your favorite Hawkeye Pierce moment from the series? Let us know in the comments below.